Again, I want to welcome everybody who is here tonight and thank you all on behalf of the Commission for attending. My name is Allison Vick. I'm the historian and program coordinator for the Tennessee Holocaust Commission. And the Commission works with schools and communities across the state of Tennessee, both in person, virtually, and every combination therein. And so we really appreciate you all attending and hope that you will be able to attend some of our additional programming as well. And tonight we are deeply honored to present Dr. Victoria Barnett, who is going to deliver the second in our webinar series. And Dr. Barnett has served as the director of the programs of ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the USHMM in Washington, D.C. from 2004 to 2019. She was the Frank Talbot Jr. Endowed Visiting Professor in Jewish and Religious Studies at the University of Virginia in 2022 to 2023. From 2004 to 2014, she was one of the general editors of the multi-volume Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works English edition. She is a graduate of Indiana University, Union Theological Seminary in New York, and George Mason University. She's also the author of For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler and Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, and the translator of several works, most recently Dr. Christiana Tietz's Karl Barth, A Life in Conflict. She's written extensively about the history of the churches in Nazi Germany and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Her current research focuses on international interfaith and ecumenical circles during the Holocaust. And so it was with great honor and a deep sense of privilege that we welcome Dr. Victoria Barnett.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending. And many thanks to the Tennessee Holocaust Commission for sponsoring this program, and I'm honored to be speaking to you all this evening. I'm going to start with what I call my elevator talk, a brief perspective on Bonhoeffer that I hope doesn't offend people, but I want us this evening to try to think a little bit differently about Bonhoeffer, not as the Christian hero at the forefront of the resistance against National Socialism, but as a complex individual who lived through 12 years of a very terrible dictatorship and tried throughout that period to do the right thing. It's a very moving story. It's a story that I think should lead us to think a great deal about these kinds of issues. But the Bonhoeffer that is most commonly portrayed in popular films and movies and novels is what I would call the Lone Ranger type Bonhoeffer, the Christian hero who's the forefront of the fight against National Socialism, saves Jews, fights for the integrity of his church, ends up in the German resistance, is horribly executed by the Nazis shortly before the end of the Second World War. And this is the story that has captured Christians now for over 80 years, since shortly after the end of the First or the Second World War. And one can see why this version of him came out so soon. In a way, Bonhoeffer in 1945, 1950 was what people thought a hero looked like. He was male, he was a German pastor, well-educated, very articulate. He had already published theological works that were already being read by Christians in the English-speaking world, and he already knew some people, notably Reinhold Niebuhr in this country and Bishop George Bell in Great Britain, who early after the war already were proclaiming the significance of his actions. So it's interesting to see why he emerged so soon as a heroic figure. But in the intervening years, there's been a great deal of literature that is much more critical about the entire period, critical in terms of looking at the German churches, at the complicity even within the confessing church, of the ways in which the church failed to save Jews or help the Jewish community. And more broadly, the complicity, the dynamics of complicity, even within the German resistance. But interestingly enough, this version of these new understandings of history have been lost in the Bonhoeffer narrative. And I think that's partly because what we're seeing in sort of this heroic narrative, and this is the kind that pops up in all the movies on Bonhoeffer, is that this is sort of an Americanization of Bonhoeffer for a popular audience that doesn't look at the deeper questions of complexity, But I think that it's precisely those deeper questions which can tell us something more about him. And so I would like to talk a little bit more about those this evening. I'm going to try to share my screen with you, and I hope that the people in the Holocaust Commission can let me know if this does not work. Let's see. Are you seeing the screen? Excellent. So my title this evening is Bonhoeffer, A View from Below. If you've read Bonhoeffer, you're probably familiar with that phrase, because late in 1942, he writes a little essay called After 10 Years, which he concludes by saying that one thing of great value for those in the resistance had been that they finally understood the view from below, that is, the view from the perspective of the victims of National Socialism. With a view from below here, I mean something a little bit different. A view of Bonhoeffer sort of on the grassroots level, not as a leading figure in the church, but as one good person among many who was trying to do the right thing in this period. And so let me see if I can get this slide moved. Yes. I have three parts of my presentation this evening. The first, I want to look specifically at looking at Bonhoeffer in the context of the Holocaust. What exactly did he do? What does his theology tell us? How did it reflect his compassion and engagement on behalf of the Jewish community? My second theme will be, what did resistance really look like? Not the Lone Ranger version of resistance where you have a single figure who's fighting these kinds of battles, but the resistance from below, the resistance of people on the individual grassroots level, the different networks in which Bonhoeffer actually moved, and sort of exploring a different understanding of the resistance in which he was involved. And then my third section is going to be to reflect with you on how Bonhoeffer might speak to us today, if we got the history right. What does it mean to understand him not front and center, but from below? So the first section, understanding Bonhoeffer in the context of the Holocaust. This is a complicated question. I'm going to just give you a quick overview this evening, and I hope that I can leave enough time for your questions. Bonhoeffer is well known as being at the forefront of this issue beginning in 1933, partly because of this essay he wrote called The Church and the Jewish Question. Quick church history from 1933, and again, I can answer questions if you have them. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January of 1933, there was already a pro-Nazi faction within the Protestant church in place that welcomed his rise to power and immediately sought to Nazify the church. This group was called the German Christian Faith Movement, die Deutsche Christen. Here on the slide, you can see a photograph of one of their speakers. Behind him is the German Christian flag, which had a cross in the middle, a swastika over that, and a hammer and sickle to show their solidarity with the workers. And he's surrounded by stormtroopers. So this was the tenor of the German Christians from the very beginning. They wanted to Nazify the church. They wanted to align the church with the Nazi state. And one of the first actions they took in April of 1933 is that when the Nazi regime passed laws barring Jews and people of Jewish descent from the civil service, the German Christians said, okay, we are going to change church law to implement such laws within the churches. Now, many books on Bonhoeffer often get this wrong because they think that, or they say that the Nazi state actually tried to take over the churches and put this law into place within the churches. That's not what happened. So the Nazi state leaves the implementation of this law up to the different institutions, and the German Christians are the ones who push this issue. And this is the very issue that sparked the so-called German church struggle, which was the battle within German Protestantism between the German Christians, those who opposed them, which eventually became the confessing church. And that was the faction that Bonhoeffer was part of. So this is the controversy that is the topic of Bonhoeffer's essay in April 1933. He's talking specifically about whether the church can or should alter church law to bar people of Jewish descent from converting and from being members of the church. That would also apply to people who were already in the church, including some of the German pastors. It's a theological issue, of course, for Christians, not just a legal one. And so the debates begin to rage. There are at least 24 essays that I've found by German theologians and pastors on this issue in 1933. So Bonhoeffer is not the only person writing about this, but his essay is very striking for a number of reasons. To give you a little bit of background, it was published in Der Vormarsch, which was a nationalist conservative journal that subsequently became Junge Kirche, which was the publication of the Confessing Church. Its editor, Fritz Zillmann, has been described by one German historian as a Nazified Christian. That is, he was not a member of the Nazi Party, but he was certainly sympathetic to the movement. And he was an old friend of Bonhoeffer's. Bonhoeffer had a period in the late 1920s, early 1930s, where he was extremely nationalist, not part of the German Christians, not part of the Nazi Party, but where he was sympathetic to certain trends within German Protestantism. And I think that that's where the friendship with Zillmann comes out. In any case, that's where the essay appears. The manuscripts you see in the background of the slide are drafts of Bonhoeffer's original manuscript. So we have 3 drafts that have been published in the Bonhoeffer works. One is the original handwritten one that you see on the upper left-hand side of your screen. The next is a marked copy that he gets back from the journal. And the interesting thing is that the most controversial paragraph in this essay, which I'm going to show you on the next slide, is not in any of these drafts. So it appears sometime between what Bonhoeffer gets back from the journal and what they finally published. And the essay and the controversial paragraph is this one. The measures of the state against Judaism, so forth and so on. If you want you can be reading it while I'm talking about this. If you want a 1-paragraph example of Christian anti-Semitism, this is it. It calls forth all the old anti-Jewish tropes that have plagued the church since the 4th century, accusing Jews of being cursed forever because they've murdered Christ, saying that they're scattered about and they will find no rest until they convert, and that the conversion of Israel is to be the end of its suffering, and that there is a so-called Jewish question which needs to be solved, but it can only be solved in salvation history. It's an incredibly shocking and offensive paragraph for Jews, and it's not surprising that when Jews first began discussing this essay in the United States, which was in the 1970s at Holocaust conferences, they were immediately put off, and Christians who came defending Bonhoeffer had to answer for this paragraph. But it's a complicated essay because of these passages, which are other excerpts which would seem to contradict what I just showed you. Because Bonhoeffer in this essay talks about the arrangement of the German church with the German state, but then he begins to talk about what makes a church legitimate in Lutheran eyes, and when a church stops being legitimate. And what he argues in this essay is that the church ceases to exercise its authority legitimately under the understanding of God creating worldly authority, is when they begin to strip people of their rights. That is the point at which a government is no longer legitimate. And of course, that's precisely what the Nazis were doing in April 1933. He then goes on, and this is the section on your left that you're looking at, to outline 3 possibilities for the church when this happens. And this is the famous 3-point thing: questioning the state as to whether it's legitimate or not, making the state responsible for what it does. Secondly, the church is supposed to help the victims of the state's actions, whether they are Christian or not. And then finally, the 3rd possibility is not just to help the victims, to bind up the wounds of the victims, but to seize the wheel itself. That is, to stop the state from exercising the violence that it is perpetrating on the minority. So in that sense, this is a startlingly progressive and forthright statement that Bonhoeffer is making, and a risky one in April of 1933. But the complexities of this essay have led historians, notably Kenneth Barnes, in an essay he wrote back in 1999, to talk about the tensions within the essay itself, where he says his hagiographies see in this essay the basis of a strong defense of the Jews, and the detractors find it horribly anti-Jewish. And he says these varying assessments are possible because Bonhoeffer contradicts himself throughout the essay. That is, it seems to be a patchwork of different thoughts. But Barnes concludes, and this was the judgment of many Holocaust scholars, in the shadow of the Holocaust, Bonhoeffer's words and action appear small, tentative, restrained, and ambivalent. The Bonhoeffer phenomenon illustrates that people would rather huddle around one point of light, no matter how feeble and flickering the flame, than sit alone in darkness. There are several other things that Bonhoeffer is involved in 1933. Let me move on to those before coming back to this controversy about that April 1933 essay. A primary one is the Bethel Confession, which is then put together in August of 1933, again by a group of theologians, Bonhoeffer is one of them, who are going through, and at this point, this is a theological statement. They're trying to outline what Christians believe so as to push back against what the German Christians are propagating within the churches. And the Bethel Confession in the August version has two paragraphs that are very strongly repudiations of Christian anti-Semitism. One is that the crucifixion of Christ is not the fault of the Jewish people alone, it's the fault of the people who actually crucified him. And the second is that the Old Testament cannot be recognized simply as the predecessor of the New Testament. That is, it's not only valid in terms of the birth of Jesus, which is supersessionism. So this is a condemnation of Christian supersessionism in which the New Testament has superseded the Old. And the Bethel Confession actually includes this remarkable statement that such supersessionism is religious anti-Semitism, and that's the term that they use. August 1933, it's a stunning statement, and one of the few such statements in German Protestantism throughout the 1930s. It was written by the Swiss theologian Wilhelm Fischer, who's portrayed on this slide, but Bonhoeffer was involved in this. And in this August meeting where they were hashing all this through, a number of more conservative church leaders, including Martin Niemöller, argued that they couldn't put that in. And indeed, it was removed from the final version. Bonhoeffer refused to sign it. And in September 1933, Bonhoeffer leaves for London, in part because he is so frustrated by these conversations. A complex history in 1933. What are we to make of all this? Of course, I'm giving you the short version, but it shows the extent to which Bonhoeffer in 1933 is quickly pulled into these theological conversations about the direction that the church should take. And this, at this point, I should say, this was an internal church debate. An interesting insight, however, comes from a man named Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, a pastor who we'll get to in a moment, but an old friend of the Bonhoeffer family. He had known Dietrich Bonhoeffer's father since before the First World War, and he had known Bonhoeffer and his brothers and sisters for a long time. So he was a mentor, in a sense, to Bonhoeffer. And Sigmund Schulze, as he wrote after 1945 about all this, noted that when Bonhoeffer visited him in Switzerland in 1941, he actually sought him out to apologize to him, saying that in 1933 he had been listening to the wrong people. And then Sigmund Schulze goes on to say the words on the screen, that Bonhoeffer tended to trust people and be optimistic. In any case, when Sigmund Schulze later spoke with him, Bonhoeffer often said how bitter he was that the people he thought he could trust were not trustworthy. So it's a snapshot both of Bonhoeffer's early writings with regard to this issue in 1933, but also his later recognition that he had made mistakes. And we need to keep in mind that he was a young man. He was 27 in 1933. So that brings me to my second point. So what did resistance and rescue actually look like? And there's a reason why I ended the last section with Sigmund Schulze, because he begins this one. If you're ever looking for a German pastor who immediately in 1933 reached out to the Jewish community and tried to help German Jews. This is the guy. Sigmund Schulze was the real deal. He had been a pacifist in the First World War. He actually helped found the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. In the 1920s, he visited Hull House in Chicago. He met with Jane Addams, and he visited a similar center in London with the intent of coming back to Germany and founding a similar center, a home for people who were looking for work, for people who were hungry, for people who needed social assistance, and founded such a place in Berlin in the mid-1920s. It was a remarkable project, and his volunteers came from the widest possible array of people, from Christians, Jews, Quakers, communists, labor union organizers. There were many women who volunteered. And one of the fascinating things when you look at his center in the 1920s and see where people ended up is that many of them who stay in Nazi Germany then begin to reach out to each other and form small resistance and rescue organizations. Klaus and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were both volunteers in the 1920s in his center, so they knew him. In 1932, for example, Sigmund Schulze arranged a meeting for a group of American church leaders who came to Berlin because they had heard reports about a rise in anti-Semitism. And Sigmund Schulze set up all these meetings with them, with Catholic leaders, Jewish leaders, Protestant leaders, to discuss the political situation in Berlin. So when Hitler came to power in January 1933, Sigmund Schulze immediately reached out to Rabbi Leo Baeck and said, "What can I do?" And as a result, the Nazis arrest him in June of 1933. He's imprisoned, and then he and his family are expelled from Nazi Germany in 1933. In July of 1933, he goes to Switzerland and does not return until after the Second World War. But what happens then is that the people who have worked with him, these circles that are already in many senses in place, begin to work with each other to help people in Switzerland, to help Jews in Germany, to help people get out of Germany. And there is this remarkable network of people that then emerges and that stays in place until 1945. I'm not going to tell you every single person's story here. Some of them are German, some of them are Swiss, some of them are French, some of them are American. I've given their names left to right so you can see who they are. Jews and Christians working together. And the interesting thing when you begin to look at these groups, and many of them are in the Confessing Church, is that when you get into the weeds, and this is the research I've been doing for the past 8 years or so, you begin to see Bonhoeffer sightings where we didn't know Bonhoeffer was involved. That is, Bonhoeffer was involved in these kinds of networks on the grassroots level, simply trying to help people. He was not the hero on the white horse, the Lone Ranger, but one among many good people who were trying to do the right thing. The names that I've put in red font in here are names of people who have been recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles. And then I have crosses after the names of people who were executed by the Nazis, like the Hans and Sophie Scholl from the White Rose Group. One such example of these connections that we're just beginning to discover is one fascinating one that involves an American rabbi, Rabbi Morse Lazarin, a rabbi from Baltimore, who was the Jewish staff member in the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Rabbi Lazarin actually travels to Nazi Germany from February 1935 to May. He's in Berlin for 3 months, coming initially because he thinks that he's going to be, having contacts to different interfaith people in Berlin. And once he gets in Berlin, he just realizes these people desperately need help. And he's besieged by people who want to get out. They hear that there's an American rabbi in town. They really want to see if he can help them get an American visa. And so that's what he ends up doing during the weeks he's there. But he spends one evening in the Bonhoeffer family home because the Bonhoeffers reach out to him to help Karl Bonhoeffer's assistant, Dr. Franz Kramer, and his wife emigrate. And the letter that you see here is one of the copies I found in the archives where Kramer writes Lazarin and says, I hope you'll remember we had this conversation in the Bonhoeffer family. This is a remarkable story for many reasons, one of which is that to invite an American rabbi into your home in Berlin in the winter of 1935 is a risk. The Gestapo was already spying on people, and they were certainly spying on Lazarin, and the Bonhoeffer family was under observation as well. So this was the kind of thing that was happening. But the other fascinating thing, now Bonhoeffer during this time, I should add, is actually still in London. So he's not in Berlin while this is happening. In fact, I'm still trying to figure out if Lazarin met him in England before he went to Berlin. But in any case, Lazarin comes back to the United States, begins to give speaking tours about his experiences in Nazi Germany. In 1936, gets a letter from a man named Ray Sweetman, who belongs to the student Christian movement. Sweetman's planning to go over to Nazi Germany, and he writes to Lazarin and says, who should I be in touch with? And Lazarin says, the younger Dr. Bonhoeffer, that is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I found this documentation in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So there's still pieces of the puzzle about Bonhoeffer that we don't know, primarily because they're on this grassroots level. Another thing that Bonhoeffer did during this era that we know a little bit about from Bethke's work is getting information about the genocide, both to people in Geneva, to the World Council of Churches, beginning with his report on the mass deportation that began in October of 1941, but also several trips to Rome in which they carried news of the genocide to the Vatican and met privately with leading figures, not with the Pope himself, but certainly with the Pope's second-hand men, Robert Leiber and Ivo Seeger. So this is one of the things that they're doing. But to explain more about what rescue looked like at the basis from below, if you will, an interesting story is about Operation 7. Now, if you've ever watched a Bonhoeffer movie or read one of the biographies, this is featured rather prominently in the story. This is the rescue operation that came out of Admiral Canaris's office, that is from the German resistance circles, to rescue 14 individuals and get them safely into Switzerland. 11 of them were Christians of Jewish descent. 3 of them, the man shown here, Fritz Arnold, and his wife and daughter, were not converted. They were Jewish. Operation 7 in the films is often portrayed as, Bonhoeffer drives Jews to the border and helps them across into Switzerland. In reality, most of the people in Operation 7 had absolutely no idea that Bonhoeffer or anyone else from the resistance was involved, because the people who actually helped them were the people on the grassroots, the networks that were secretly helping people anyway. And this is a key example. Arnold is rescued through Operation 7, makes his way to Switzerland, manages to get to Switzerland. And in 1945, right after the end of the war, the World Council of Churches refugee director Adolf Freudenberg wrote to Arnold and said, who helped you? Who hid you? Who provided your family with ration cards? Who got you from one place to another? Who got you over the border? And Fritz Arnold sent him the list you see here. These are the names of the people who helped him get out. Like I said, he probably didn't even realize that Bonhoeffer was somehow on the edges of this. And to be honest, Eberhard Bethke's biography mentions that Bonhoeffer is very peripheral to this rescue attempt. He's not one of the rescuers, if you will. So it shows again the interesting gap between the redemptive history of the Christian hero and what was actually happening on the ground. So the people that Bonhoeffer tried to help, all eventually helped by networks, not just one individual. These are the names of people that, as I went through the Bonhoeffer works, I began to look for people who reached out to Bonhoeffer either directly or where somebody writes Bonhoeffer and says, can you help with so-and-so? And these are the names. They're all Christian with the exception of the first name, Siegfried Landshut and his wife. This was a colleague of Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi. But these are people who Bonhoeffer helped. And it shows again this level of, where he was spending a lot of his time actually, in terms of quietly trying to help people, not necessarily being at the forefront of anything against the Nazi regime, but being about something else. So how does this shape our understanding of Bonhoeffer from below when we look at this grassroots level? I think we see many insights into this when we read his prison letters, his wartime writings, for two reasons. One is that by 1941, 1942, he has a deep sense that his nation and his church have failed. Part of the story here is that he lost the battle for the confessing church, that the confessing church remained part of the main church. It largely conformed to what the church was doing. There weren't many people really willing to speak out about the importance of standing up against the German Christian heresies. And so, that's part of the story. But part of the story is also, I think, his experiences with people on the grassroots of simply trying to help people who are desperate to get out. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has the American Friends Service Committee records, which are the refugee records of everybody of the Quaker organization, which was the most help to people getting out. And each of those files, they're about this thick, and some of them are several files this thick, tell the story of one individual who tries, Jews who were trying to get out did everything they could. They wrote to everybody they could think of. They wrote to distant relatives in the United States. They contacted church groups. They wrote to people in Switzerland. And Arnold does actually a very thick file on Fritz Arnold in the Quaker Files, because he was doing the same thing. So Bonhoeffer's experience with the desperation of the victims and his sober assessment of the failings of his church are evident in this first quote here. Our church has been fighting during these years only for its self-preservation, as if that were an end in itself. It has become incapable of bringing the word of reconciliation and redemption to humankind in the world. So the only way we can be Christians today is through prayer and doing justice among human beings. It's an interesting, sober assessment from great theological mind. And then, of course, the second quotation I have here, which is from his essay from 1942, after 10 years. If you read one thing of Bonhoeffer, this is the one that I would recommend. It's available as a separate little publication with an introduction that I wrote, but it's also the first text that is in Letters and Papers from Prison. And this is what he concludes with. It's written to one of his fellow conspirators, and then his fellow conspirators in the Bonhoeffer family. His brother Klaus was involved in the resistance, as were two of his brothers-in-law, Hans von Donati and Rüdiger Schleicher. All four would be executed. And so this is something that he shared with his family at Christmas 1942. I've been told that his father read from it every night during the Christmas days. And that final section in which he says, we have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We've become cunning and learned the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Are we still of any use? Is a bleak and damning statement to himself. But he then concludes in a section called The View from Below. And here he means it differently than I do. It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. In April of 2015, on the 70th anniversary of his death, of his execution, I wrote a little piece for the Washington Post, and I think I would like to close this evening with my own reflections there, because this is what I'm trying to talk about this evening when I think of Bonhoeffer as someone we need to think about from below, because that's the level at which all of us are grappling with reality. If we can understand Bonhoeffer not as a saint, not as a mythological hero, but as someone who reflected poignantly on evil's consequences for the human conscience and spirit, for an entire culture and country, we may begin to uncover the man behind the mythology, a man who tried to face the darkness of its times. In the process, we may discover someone who can speak more directly to the darkness and failures of our own times. And I will close there. I want to leave enough time for questions and your thoughts. But thank you so much again for inviting me this evening and for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett, for that excellent presentation. I know that we all welcomed it very much. I see that we have a couple questions already coming in the Q&A, so I want to start with those. And certainly if there are additional questions, feel free to please post those in the Q&A and we'll address them as we get to them. But I want to start with one that sort of speaks to some of the things you mentioned in your closing remarks on Bonhoeffer, which is, why is he so well known for helping the Jewish people if so much of the work he actually did was on the margins?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that this speaks to the power of the mythology, that this is one of the myths that kind of emerged after 1945. And especially in the 1960s and 70s, as scholars and Christians began to pay more attention to the Holocaust itself. Bonhoeffer was the name everybody knew. And so you had Bonhoeffer scholars often exaggerating his role in ways, and this is why I mentioned the Barnes book, because as soon as this conversation began, there was pushback from the Jewish community and sort of a lot of attempts to justify Bonhoeffer, to try to pull certain quotes out. And one of the issues here was that Eberhard Bethge, his biographer and close friend, who was alive until 2000, so he remained part of conversations until the very end, really. He would answer these questions very thoughtfully and honestly. He was a good human being, and I think really wrestled with this issue in his own life as a post-war German. But people sort of assumed that when Bethge was answering something, that it was Bonhoeffer speaking. And so there's a process, I think, of real distortion there that deserves looking at. At the same time, almost nothing is known about the things I've been talking about this evening, the ways in which privately he helped people. And I think that that's necessary research. In fact, if there are any students listening this evening, there are a couple of dissertations and theses to be written here, because this also gives us a different lens on him. So I hope that that's a helpful answer. Next question is, what is the name of the book we should read if we only read one of Bonhoeffer's? Oh my. Each book has its own character. So for example, if you want to read the books that he wrote for his seminarians in Nazi Germany in the mid-1930s, he taught an illegal confessing church seminary. He was trying to train them to be pastors in a totalitarian state. So he was trying to instill in them a certain sense of what it really means to live the gospel in a different way. The books that he wrote during that period, and he dedicated them to his seminarians, was his book on discipleship and his book on life together, which is a wonderful little reader. If you want to read books that get into the things that I've been talking about, I think his prison letters are probably the best place to start. And even though they're more difficult, they're a little bit more expensive and more difficult to read, I would argue that you do use the Bonhoeffer Works translations simply because they're better. And we also corrected some mistakes that were in earlier translations. And the most popular books, like Letters and Papers from Prison, are available in paperback editions where they've taken all the footnotes out. Great question. What happened after the war to the church leaders that supported the Nazis? So it's a wonderful question. For the most part, they got off. The leading members of the German Christian faith movement got their hands slapped. They were not given prominent positions in the post-war church, but they got jobs as hospital chaplains. There were only a very few that were completely let go, usually because they had been involved in other Nazi crimes. And there was a sense and it's a complicated question because of the denazification era and that period between 1945 and 1950, when a lot of this stuff is coming out. And then with the beginning of the Cold War, the door kind of slammed shut, and Germans, including their church, are ready to move on. But that's the short answer. Implications for our current moment. I think that's one of the reasons why I was emphasizing the view from below this evening, that I think Bonhoeffer is a thinker who lived through that time with his eyes open and with a very honest assessment of what was happening around him. A big part of this story is the complicity of so many ordinary Germans, so many of their pastors and clergy, so many of their theologians, so many professionals. The complicity, we often talk about fascism as something that is, installed from above, but in reality, fascism arises a great deal in the process of people conforming to the new regime, and that happened very quickly in Nazi Germany. There's a wonderful description by the historian Clemens von Klemper of Nazi Germany as a so-called consensual dictatorship, which means that it was a dictatorship. It was a police state, and people were frightened of opposing it. But at the same time, people began to recalibrate and make their adjustments to the new regime. And this was one of the things I think that we see in Bonhoeffer that really led him to despair. One of the interesting things about Bonhoeffer is that he leaves Nazi Germany several times. And I personally think that part of that is just that he feels the need to get out, that he's in despair at the leadership of his church. Excuse me. He sees people conforming. He sees where all this is going. And he needs to get out, but he ultimately comes back because he realizes that this is his fight. So I think that when we think of the challenges today, reaching out, I mean, the other part of this is what I've been talking about this evening, reaching out to people on the grassroots level and helping the people that you can, the people who reach out to you for help. And this is a big aspect, I would say, of life in the 21st century in any case, that we should all be looking around to see where we can be involved in a way that can help people, that we can be of use. My own experience is that once you open that door, other doors open, and you find yourself part of a network of people who are eager to help. And in a way, this is what happens with the circles that work with Sigmund Schultz after 1933, even after he's kicked out. The other people are still there working to help people. So that would be some reflections to your question. An announcement that Augsburg Fortress Press is offering 30% off all their Bonhoeffer titles. So you want to buy some books, buy some books. A good question. I understand that many in Germany saw him as a traitor after the war. Is this true? When did Germany begin to appreciate him? It is somewhat true. I used to think it was much truer than it turns out to be, because the interesting thing is that post-war Germany soon found a use for him, and this too is part of the creation of a mythology. There's an interesting film that the Adenauer government made in 1930 or 1955, and it's a short clip. It's about 38 minutes long, of one of the war crimes trials of one of the people who tried and executed him. And the beginning of this clip is it was distributed by the Adenauer government's Office of Public Education. So they're using this as a teachable moment. And the very beginning of the film shows Bonhoeffer, Donani, Beck, and Knaris, four of the people who had been executed in Flossenburg. And then they go to this trial. And throughout the film, they're sort of talking about how a democratic government has a trial, what the Nazi government did. So they're using it as a teachable moment, but it shows that Bonhoeffer was already rehabilitated, in a sense, in 1945 or 1955. And one of the reasons is that the Adenauer government in 1955 wanted to bring back the military. So this was also perhaps a propagandistic effort to convince the West that Germany had learned its lesson, that they were praising the right people, the people would stood up against the Nazis, and that they could be depended on to have a responsible military. So the ways in which Bonhoeffer has been used for certain political angles, not just in the United States, but also in Germany, is a story in itself.
And Dr. Barnett, I'm a little bit hesitant to answer this, but it's a little bit of or ask this, but it's a little bit of the elephant in the room. And I'm sure you know where I'm going because we've talked about this to some together as well. Is if you could speak just a little bit about to your professional sort of opinion and thoughts about the new film that's coming out that's being heavily marketed right now.
Right, sure. So I'm the worst person in the world to watch a Bonhoeffer movie with, full disclosure, because I pick things apart. So I would say the new movie has a lot of mistakes, but that's true of most of the films. The two parts of the film that I find most problematic, one is that Bonhoeffer is portrayed from the beginning to the end. You can see this in the film poster because it shows Bonhoeffer in a trench coat with a gun, holding a gun in his hand, is that Bonhoeffer is the assassin. And he's the righteous man who is going to mow down the evil Nazis. And this is kind of the narrative throughout the film. And that, I think, really violates who he was as a theologian. And it's a dangerous, I think it's a dangerous signal to people who might tend toward political violence. There have already been cases in the United States, I think back in the early 1990s. There was a man who murdered an abortion doctor and his bodyguard and invoked Bonhoeffer and said, the reason I did this was because just like Bonhoeffer, I'm fighting against evil. And one of the things to think about, this is a question that often comes up when I speak about Bonhoeffer, because people have trouble putting his pacifist writings together with where he ends up. And so they say, well, how did Bonhoeffer justify his involvement in this conspiracy that was going to kill Hitler and leading Nazis to overthrow the government? I posed this question to Eberhard Bethge back in the 1980s when I was working on my first book. And Bethge gave me a two-word answer. He said he didn't try to justify it theologically. He understood that you shouldn't do that, can't do that. What Bonhoeffer did, and this is at the core of his writings in his book on ethics, is he said, if you take an action that you know is sinful, but you're willing to defend it, and you're willing to stand by it, and you take it of your own responsibility, and you know that on the day of judgment, you will answer to God for what you have done. That's how he understood what he was doing. And so it's not, he doesn't see this as a Christian act. He doesn't claim the sanction of his church. It's a complicated situation, but he lived in a terrible time. And so I think understanding Bonhoeffer in that sense is important. The other thing about the film is that, again, I think it gives a nationalist tone to Bonhoeffer's, mission. And there are numerous references throughout the movie, things like, the enemy has invaded us from within, that there are things in that movie that sound like some of what you hear Christian nationalists say today. And that's why the Bonhoeffer Society came out and warned against him. That's why 86 members of the Bonhoeffer family in Germany have said, we need to be clear here, Bonhoeffer was not a Christian nationalist. And even the actors in the film have distanced themselves from that understanding of it. So if you see it, I think it's possible to go see that movie and miss all this stuff, except for what I first mentioned, the fact that he's really falsely portrayed as being at the forefront of the resistance, but that's the Lone Ranger version that I'm talking about. But these other elements, I think, are worth reflecting and critically reflecting.
And we've got a couple other questions, Dr. Barnett, for you. And then one from Karen Johnson's asking, was he brought in for questioning before his arrest?
Yeah, there were several occasions actually on which the Gestapo picked him up for questioning, beginning in 1933. And then again, when he was teaching the seminary at Finkenwalde, he's brought in for questioning. And he is arrested in April of 1942 or 43 in connection with Operation 7, but because what Canaris's office did for Operation 7 was send large amounts of money into Switzerland, excuse me, to facilitate the visas for these people. And so the Gestapo, as they were tracking this, thought it was a case of money laundering. So he's arrested on that count and then questioned. He was in prison from that point on until his death. But only after the July 20th, 1944 attempt, excuse me, I'm going to have to cough for a minute. Only after that attempt did the screws tighten, because only after that did they connect him to the broader conspiracy. Before then, the family actually hoped he would be released. So in many ways, it's a very poignant story to follow as you read through the Bonhoeffer works and see, people getting their hopes up, and then seeing, once the Gestapo realizes that all these members of the family are involved, that's when they really crack down on everybody. There's a good question here about Hitler's Willing Executioners, the book that was published several decades ago by Daniel Goldhagen. Goldhagen was critical of Germans in general. He sort of sees this as a widespread, deep-seated anti-Semitism that Germans held, that was what led to the Holocaust. Oh, I just lost this question. Let me go back to it because I want to see the full question. Is there a way to do that? Let's see. Yes, okay. Goldhagen felt that though Bonhoeffer was very sympathetic to the mass murder of the Jews and destruction of his beloved German, he remained anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism was so systemic within Bonhoeffer that despite his heroic deeds, he always saw the Jews were inferior. Would you agree with that view? It's, this is a complicated question, because I think that anti-Semitism, when it's instilled in you, you can critically think about it and work against it consciously and deliberately. It doesn't mean it ever goes completely away. I remember when I was writing my first book and I interviewed Helmut Gollwitzer, the theologian, and I asked him about, whether he was aware of anti-Semitism growing up. And I remember him saying to me, "Ach, Frau Barnett, we were all anti-Semitic. It was part of the air we breathed." And that notion that the culture was that this was deep-seated enough that people had to work to unthink it, is something that's worth thinking about. I cannot guarantee that Bonhoeffer was horrified by what was happening, and he worked against it. You can really see that, especially in the reports he carries out about the deportations of Jews, about his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi in particular, kept a running list of all the atrocities the Nazi regime was perpetrating against Jews. And that was some of the information that they carried to the Vatican and some of what they carried to the World Council of Churches in Geneva. So they're working against it. The extent to which their hearts were changed, it's a hard question to answer, and I want to give you an honest answer. I don't want to just say, "Oh, of course," because I think that it's a more complex question than that we do need to keep in mind. So I don't know if there are other questions. Let's see, open questions too. My in-laws claim we have no idea that how little information the average German had during the war. Did the average German know about Bonhoeffer and what happened during the war years? So the first question, did they know about Bonhoeffer? Probably not, unless they were in the Confessing Church or in Berlin. It was interesting when I wrote my first book, and it was about the confessing church, and I interviewed all these Germans who had been in the confessing church. And some of the people I interviewed said they had never heard of him until after 1945. So people didn't automatically know about Bonhoeffer. Did they know what was going on? I think they did. I interviewed enough people who said to me, if anybody tells you they didn't know, you can't believe them, because there were so many rumors and there were so many things that happened in plain sight. If you look at the concentration camp systems throughout Germany, even before 1939, when you look at the deportations which take place in broad daylight, when you look at Jews who were deported from major cities, and afterward there were auctions that Germans could go down to and get their furniture, people knew. Maybe they didn't know about the gas chambers, but they knew that Jews were not coming back. And it's a strong indictment, but I really believe that. Another question, Michael Wilkins, wonderful to see your name. Do you see an element of the view from below in the theological letters from prison in April or July 1944? Yes, definitely. I think that's, those prison letters are where we see this, a deep theological wrestling with the guilt of his country and his church, and trying to understand. This is, of course, the same period during which he writes after 10 years. So I think that this becomes a theme, and we know that Bonhoeffer in prison was working on a book that he hoped to complete after the war on ethics, and I think that it would have been a remarkable work had he been able to complete it, because he was wrestling. One of the things about Bonhoeffer that I have come to admire as I've worked through his writings is his honesty. He tries to look directly at the reality that's confronting him and think about what that really means as a human being and theologically. Are there other questions here? Let's see.
I think we've hit it for tonight, everybody. I don't see any other questions coming in, but certainly if you do post them, let us know. If anybody has another question that we haven't addressed yet. All right. Well, in that case, I want to thank everybody so much for coming tonight. I know that everybody's schedules are quite full and there are many demands on your time, but we really appreciate you all supporting us. And thank you especially to our esteemed speaker tonight, Dr. Barnett. We appreciate your time enormously. This has been a fantastic talk. I can't wait to watch the recording of it. And if anybody's interested, we will have that for you in a few days, and we can circulate that in either in a couple of weeks or something along those lines. And I want to invite everybody to join us next week as well, when our cherished Commission Chair, Rabbi Mark Shifton, will be presenting his family's story as the concluding part of our webinar series. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you again to Dr. Barnett. I hope you all have a fantastic evening.
Thank you very much.